Hello and welcome back to History for Atheists. My guests today are David Hutchings and James Ungureanu, the co-authors of Popes and Unicorns, Science, Christianity and How the Conflict Thesis Fooled the World. In this excellent and readable and very interesting book, James and David detail the origin of the conflict thesis, the idea that science and religion have been at war with each other down the ages, and why it's such a pervasive idea in popular culture, despite having been rejected by historians for about a century. In our discussion, they outline this story, and then we discuss why the conflict thesis is accepted unquestioningly by far too many atheists. So, James and David, welcome to History for Atheists. Thank you very much for coming on the show. And maybe I can get you to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your background. James, maybe if you could kick off.
Sure. I did my PhD at the University of Queensland under early modern historian Peter Harrison. That PhD eventually turned into a book, Science, Religion, and the Protestant Tradition, Retracing the Origins of Conflict. That was published, I think, in 2019. I think David Hutchings, contacted me. I think he had, who was it, Dave? Was it Tim Larson or was it Ron Numbers that you...
It was Tim Larson, yeah.
Okay, so Tim Larson contacted me and told me that this guy, Dave Hutchings, was looking to write about the conflict thesis, and kind of right up my alley. And we connected, and we thought about ways of how to popularize a more scholarly interpretation of the conflict thesis, its origins, and how it developed over time. And Dave and I worked together on the book, and it's been a lot of great fun. So I'm an intellectual historian. I do mostly history of religious thought, the development of religious thought. So I kind of dabbled in science and religion, but I think I would consider myself more of an intellectual historian of kind of theology and how theological thought has developed over the centuries.
Good. Thanks, James. And David, your background is really in science, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm a physicist. My day job is that I am a high school physics teacher. So I spend most of my time arguing with 14 to 18-year-olds.
Which is always fun.
I live in York in the north of England. I teach at the school that William Wilberforce went to. So there's one for your historian audience, Tim.
Yeah.
When he was 14, he wrote his first anti-slavery letter, and he wrote it in a room about 10 meters away from where I teach. So that's quite a claim to fame. And then I have a side gig. I have a side hustle in teaming up with intellectuals to popularize their academic work. So I've written with a fellow of the Royal Society called Tom McLeish. He's a physicist, and I did a popularization of some of his work about science and theology. And then Professor David Wilkinson at Durham, who's an astrophysicist, I did a popularization of his work on Stephen Hawking. And then I thought I'd branch out into your world, the world of history. And so this partnership with James, which ran for a couple of years really, has resulted in a book that you very kindly reviewed positively, called Of Popes and Unicorns, which is a history of science and Christianity with a particular focus on what is known as the conflict thesis, which is what we're going to be talking about today. What is it and where did it come from?
Yeah, and yeah, Popes and Unicorns is the book that inspired me to get you gentlemen on the show, and I suppose I recommend it very highly, obviously, but just to give the audience a taste of what an excellent book it is, I want to read a passage from page 222 of this book, where it talks about various tools of the internet age which can be used to counter the myths of the conflict thesis. And you say they include blogs such as Tim O'Neill's History for Atheists site, and go on to say O'Neill is an atheist himself and had become fed up with seeing fellow non-believers consistently churn out Draper and White-isms. We'll explain what that means in a moment. That he started setting the record straight online. O'Neill was both amusing and acerbic in his analysis. I think that's very true. and has won the respect of many for his no-nonsense approach, and go on to quote some nice things that Cambridge classical historian Tim Whitmarsh had to say about me and my site. So clearly your book is excellent, and I don't think we need to discuss it any further. I think we can end the conversation there. Thank you for coming on the show. But seriously, it's a great book, and the thing I like about it is, and I think David, I think you've kind of touched on it there. It's really accessible. I think anyone who has never actually thought about this topic could read it and come away, first of all, highly entertained, and slightly, there's a lot of funny stuff in the book. But also, I learned quite. I mean, I've been studying this stuff for decades. I learned several things I didn't realize before from this book. So I think that's always a good sign, because I quite often read books on topics that particularly popular books on topics I've studied, and most of the time they irritate me because they get things wrong. But even when they don't, I don't learn anything from them. So I think it's quite an accolade to you guys that you wrote a book that was entertaining for everyone, even a weird history nerd like me. So well done.
Well, thank you. I suppose teachers live or die by being interesting. If I'm teaching quantum mechanics to a 16-year-old and I'm not interesting, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
This methodology of teaming up with somebody who knows their stuff, I would argue that James is probably the world expert on the two guys we're going to talk about, Draper and White. And so that's why you can do both. I do the popularization piece, but the kind of academic solidity of it all stands on the shoulders of the expert. And so that I think that works.
I appreciate that, David. That's very flattering. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to work with you too. I wrote my book, my dissertation for academics, for scholars in the field. So it's very challenging to kind of take that information and speak to a wider audience. But your background was key to that. So I really appreciated that.
So just so we can get a bit of context on the rest of the conversation, David, you just mentioned the conflict thesis, and that's obviously what we want to discuss. And James is, as you say, the expert on Draper and White, who laid the foundations of this idea. So maybe, David, you could give us a quick summary of what the conflict thesis is, what historians are referring to when they refer to the conflict thesis, and then we'll get on to why historians reject it. But how would you summarize it?
Yeah, the summary of the conflict thesis is that there is a conflict that has always existed between religious thought and scientific or logical thought, and that those two bodies of thought have been at war all the way as far back as you dare trace it, as far back as you can trace religion, and as far back as you can trace rationality. But in particular, it focuses often on Christianity rather than vaguely on religion. Yeah. And it focuses on science wherever somebody is happy to define science as having turned up. So it's the old God versus science, pick a side motif. That's what the conflict thesis is. And then in order to back it up, there are often quite a few stories that are told, and they're treated as like data points throughout history. And you just join those data points and then you're persuaded. So those would be things like, the Christians burnt down the library of Alexandria. Christians ditched Greek and Roman learning and they banned it. And they said, we don't want anyone doing any of this stuff. And they plunged us into the Dark Ages. And then later on, they banned autopsies. So that held back medicine. Or they banned dissection, full stop. Or they banned anesthetic on religious grounds. Or they banned inoculation. They persecuted scientists so that anytime anybody raised their scientific head above the parapet, it was immediately lopped off by some priest somewhere. And then you say, well, okay, they threw Galileo in jail. There's your sort of that's the figurehead of the whole thing. And you've had guests on to talk about Galileo.
At some length.
That's right. So we don't need to cover that ground. But the basic premise is that God and science, not only do they not mix, but they're actually opposed
Cool.
to one another.
And you know, we'll come back and talk about maybe some of those examples and why they're actually not as clear cut or valid as they
Could I
are.
just add one more thing, Tim?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about the conflict thesis, it's kind of a pervasive understanding of science and religion, and no group has kind of propagated that trope than the New Atheist. But it's not just the New Atheist, right? You have politicians, you have movies, you have TV shows that say something about the relationship of science. So it's super widespread. And what's interesting about the arguments for conflict is that sometimes they are philosophical in character, but they also appeal to the historical record. And the conflict thesis, in that sense, is very much a historical argument. It's an argument that is allegedly drawn from history. And most proponents of the conflict thesis maintain if you look back in history, particularly Christian history, but not exclusively Christian history, if you look back at every moment, every step or advance of progress or some new learning, religion has, in some sense, attempted to oppose or oppress that progress. So I think it's really important to understand that the conflict thesis is very much a historical argument. It's very much an argument based on history and not just philosophical.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's probably why I'm fascinated by it. But James, we've mentioned Draper and White a couple of times, and we all know who we're referring to. But for those listeners and viewers who don't, who are Draper and White, and why is it sometimes called the Draper-White thesis rather than the conflict thesis? So who are these guys, and what's their significance in this whole issue?
James, that's you.
Oh, sure. Well, it's not just it's Draper and White, but it's not just Draper and White. I mean, many historians over the last 100 years have kind of traced the origins of this thesis, this conflict thesis, to the 19th century, specifically to Anglo-American writers. They point to the so-called scientific naturalists, people like biologist Thomas H. Huxley, physicist John Tyndall, or evolutionary philosopher Herbert Spencer, among others, who supposedly employed this kind of conflict narrative in their attempt to professionalize and secularize the sciences. But more specifically, more precisely, besides the scientific naturalists in general, most historians point to these two particular whipping boys, the New York University chemist John William Draper and historian and first president of Cornell University, Andrew Dickson White. The vast majority of scholars now claim that Draper and White were sort of the co-founders of this thesis, that they were the architects. So we could talk a little bit about their background. I'll start with Draper, and then maybe David could say something about White.
Sure.
Draper was actually an English-born American physicist or a chemist. His father was an itinerant Wesleyan minister, interestingly enough. There's actually quite a really kind of complicated and interesting story about Draper's father's vocation. Draper's father was actually raised Catholic, and during a local revival meeting in England, Draper's father went with some friends to kind of mock the revivalists at that meeting. But by the end of the meeting, Draper's father had converted to Methodism. At age 11, Draper was sent to a Methodist boarding school, presumably to follow in his father's footsteps and prepare him for the ministry. Draper's father, though, had these kind of strong nonconformist outlook, and he had this penchant for scientific subjects like chemistry and astronomy. So it's no surprise that Draper's father sent the young Draper to study chemistry and medicine at University of College London, also known then as London University, which, unlike Oxford and Cambridge at the time, did not require any kind of religious tests for enrollment. Unfortunately, Draper's father died almost as soon as he started his studies. But Draper was a kind of a very determined young man. He completed his degree, he got married, and then emigrated to the United States. He had family living in Virginia for some time at that point. Draper established himself very quickly as a leading scientist. He taught at a couple different schools before becoming head of chemistry at New York University in 1837. He was known for his photochemistry. He's believed to be the first person to take a picture of a human face, that being his sister. He's also one of the earliest scientists to practice astrophotography. He has this really interesting 1840 photograph of the moon. he took. But Draper soon gave up chemistry and science in general for history. There's actually a very interesting letter between him and John Tyndall, the physicist, the scientific naturalist. He wrote to John Tyndall saying that nobody reads physics, everybody reads history. So he's kind of switching over into the historical discipline. So he published in 1876 this history of the conflict between religion and science. And there he claimed that history of science was this narrative of conflict between two contending powers, the expansive force of the human intellect on the one side and the compression arising from traditionary faith and human interests on the other. He would sort of go on to explain that faith in its nature is unchangeable, it's stationary. Science in its nature is progressive, and as a result, they will come into conflict. So that's kind of in a nutshell what Draper, at least what historians argue Draper said.
Got it. Thanks. And David, if you could maybe pick up there and talk to us a little bit about the other half of the duo and how he fits in.
Sure. So Andrew Dixon White was born about 20 years after Draper. He was born in the US, and his parents wanted him to become a minister himself. So he was sort of packed off to school to prepare for that, but he hated it. Genuinely he didn't want to become a minister, but he also hated the process of getting prepared for it. So he ran away from the institution they'd sent him to. And eventually, after some negotiation, his family agreed that he could go to Yale and study what he really wanted to study, which was history and literature. Those were his real loves. He was incredibly gifted and talented as a historian, as a student of literature, and as a writer, and as a speaker. In his first year at Yale, he won an essay prize that at the time was the most valuable university prize anywhere in the world. And the idea that someone in their first year would win it was bonkers. So he was exceptional as a student, very charismatic, and it wasn't long before he was able to win his own professorships, and professorships where he was sort of able to teach what he wanted to teach because of this charismatic drive and this wide range of interests. So he taught history across all periods. He taught all sorts of literature from all around the world. He taught philosophy. He was fascinated by the Reformation. He saw Martin Luther as one of the great heroes in all of history because Luther would champion the individual's ability to think their way through the biggest questions rather than having to sit under some other authority. And he had a period of time in Germany where he was going on a grand tour, which was quite common for young men to do a grand tour of Europe. And Germany sort of got within his heart. He loved the German education system. He loved the German theologians. He loved the freedom that he found in German universities. So later in life, when he was elected to the Senate against his will, he actually saw an opportunity because he met somebody called Ezra Cornell, who was very, very rich. Cornell was a Quaker. And between them, I can imagine that a lot of this was White's own persuasiveness, but between them, they agreed to found a university. And that's where Cornell University made its appearance. Sure. Obviously taking the name of Ezra Cornell, but White was the founding president. And the whole idea of Cornell University was that it would be a freer place than normal universities or previous universities, which were usually in some way affiliated to a church organization. And so this was going to be non-sectarian. That's what White was really excited about, a non-sectarian university, one where he said anybody of any mindset can come and study any subject. And so that was his great passion. It doesn't mean that it wasn't to be a religious university, because White would still have called himself a Christian, and he still said, we must teach about Christ. But as we perhaps will go on to find out in this conversation, his version of Christ might be quite radically different to what we expect.
Sure. So the books that they wrote, I mean, I take James's point, and I think one of the things that your book makes very, very clear is that these guys didn't appear from a vacuum. They were part of a tradition. There were a lot of precursors to them. There were lots of heirs to them as well. But the books that these guys wrote were heavily influential. In fact, David, you made me very jealous earlier on. You were waving around some, I think, first edition copies.
I've got them here. Yeah.
Yes, here they are. So maybe you could, James, if you could tell us first of all about Draper's book and its context, and then David, if you could tell us about White's.
Yeah, sure. Again, most historians blame Draper and White for constructing this narrative, but I came to their books in a very similar way. I initially wanted to write about the scientific revolution from the kind of perspective of the French philosophers, but then my supervisor, Peter Harrison, said, "Why don't you write a book about Draper and White? No one's really written a book just completely devoted to Draper and White." And I said, sure. I assumed that they were they created this conflict narrative, that they were atheists. But when I started reading all their work, even going into the archives, Draper's correspondence and all his archives are stored at the Library of Congress. And Andrew Dixon White is at Cornell University. You can actually view for free now the entire database of White's letters, and there's thousands and thousands of letters and diaries. And once you get into there, I came away with a completely different perspective on who Draper and White were. Not to say that their arguments are true, but my particular interest in working on Draper and White, besides my supervisor telling me to work on Draper and White, is that I'm not interested in debunking the narratives of Draper and White as much as trying to understand what they argued. I think the whole debunking process has been done by a lot of historians. I actually want to understand what their motivations were, what they actually believed. And to answer those questions, things got complicated really fast.
What was Draper's book, and what was he trying to do when he wrote that book?
Most historians say that Draper wanted to attack the Roman Catholic Church, right? It was kind of a diatribe against the Roman Catholic Church, that he was anti-Catholic. I'm not convinced by that argument, because mostly everybody in the second half of the 19th century were anti-Catholic. So it's not really a unique perspective in that sense. And Draper and White were equally anti-Catholic. What I think Draper was advocating in his book is more of a return to a pure, more rational Christianity. In his early lectures on chemistry, the students at New York, for example, he sounded rather like a natural theologian. Draper spoke of the laws of nature as designed and set in place by an almighty God, the creator, the great architect. So this kind of rational, more reasonable Christianity comes from folks like Francis Bacon, early members of the Royal Society of London. And you see this also in the English deists. You see this in also in folks like John Locke. And interestingly enough, all of them looked back to the Protestant Reformation as a reformation not only of religion, but also science, or natural philosophy, as it was called then. We can return to that idea later. And anyway, looking at the entire corpus of Draper's writing is important. And Draper, his history of the conflict was actually a largely condensed version of previously published works. And most importantly, Draper had published his History of the Intellectual Development of Europe in 1863, almost a decade before he published History of Conflict. And in this book, he made this kind of crucial distinction that I think most historians of science have forgotten and ignored. He's discussing the so-called paganization of Christianity under Emperor Constantine.
Constantine, the villain. He constantly pops up.
Yeah. So Draper is distinguishing between Christianity and ecclesiastical. He calls it ecclesiastical organizations. And
Sure.
if I can quote him, he says the former is a gift of God, meaning that Christianity is a gift of God, and the latter are the product of human exigencies and human invention, and therefore open to criticism or, if need be, to condemnation. End quote. So he argued that the paganization of Christianity had resulted in the tyranny of theology over thought, and had declared that those who had known what religion was in the apostolic days, the early church fathers in the apostolic days, might look with boundless surprise on what was now engrafted upon it. It was passing under its name. So these distinctions also, if one reads his history of conflict carefully, are also present in that book too. He's arguing against orthodoxy or extremist views, not the moderate ones. And at the end of his history of conflict, Draper is arguing that kind of a more moderate, more liberal Protestantism will go work together with modern science, whereas the more extreme Christianity, whether Protestantism or Catholicism, will never find any kind of relationship with Christianity. So it's very important to understand that Draper is firmly in this kind of liberal Protestant stream, this little liberal Protestant understanding of what religion was, at least for the 17th and 18th century liberal
Sure.
Protestants, where they looked at Christianity as a rational, as a reasonable religion.
Sure. And it's interesting that that he does belong to that liberal Protestant tradition, given that his arguments have been taken up almost wholesale by anti-theistic atheists, and all the stuff that you were just saying actually fits very much with a lot of the narrative that you see from people like Harris and Hitchens, and even the villainy of Constantine. I recently did a video on that on this channel, and Joe Rogan, the great intellectual Joe Rogan, I began with a rant by Joe Rogan on his podcast, where he basically spouted the entire Protestant myth of Constantine hijacking Christianity and how he was actually a wicked pagan, and how it was a paganization of the
Right.
It's pure 19th century liberal American Protestantism, but Rogan doesn't, because Rogan's an idiot. Rogan doesn't actually understand what he's saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Draper didn't have any kind of footnotes or endnotes in his book, but if you read it, the names that he brings up, like for support for his argument, are mostly Protestant historians. The Protestant history. He's drawing from Protestant polemics, which is very interesting.
And David, when you were showing me, gloatingly showing me your 2-volume copy of White's book, he does have a lot of footnotes. A lot of them are highly misleading, but his book is 2 volumes long, a much more substantial work. So tell us about White. What was he trying to do, given that Draper had already kind of written the book? So what was White doing?
Yeah, so White is also from the liberal Protestant tradition, but he takes a different approach. So where Draper says, let's turn the clock back, that's what Draper is saying. He's saying early Christianity was somehow pure, reasonable, rational, and then it got corrupted over time. White's approach is to say that humanity is undergoing a kind of unrelenting progress throughout its entire history. We don't ever want to turn the clock back, because the people who came before us were always stupid compared to the people alive now. So his take on the whole thing is quite similar in some ways to a chap called Auguste Comte, where he says, right, do you know what? Very early on, people tried to explain things, but the only way that they could explain anything was to resort to spirits. And, why was there a drought? Oh, because the local water spirit, you'd angered the local water spirit or whatever. And then you get to this second stage where you begin to realize that there are physical causes for things. But you still attribute ultimately those physical causes to still some local deity or something like that. So you've got a hybridized state, maybe. And then eventually what you're going to do is you're going to emerge out into looking at rational explanation only, physical causes only. And so for White, the Old Testament, he calls it sort of the equivalent of an elementary primer. And he says that periodically you get these great teachers who turn up who will launch humanity forwards to its next chapter. And he sees Jesus as one of those teachers. So he says, Jesus came along, he said these profound things, and that moved us into a new stage of development. And he even calls Christ's religion the true religion. But he would explain that by saying it's still not complete yet. So Jesus is on the correct path. So at the time, it would have been right to be with Jesus. But you don't then stay there. So when the next great teacher or the next great advance comes along, you then go with them. And it's hard to resist the idea when you read his work that he kind of thinks that maybe he is the next great teacher. And the man,
he was trying to save religion from itself, right? That's what he claimed.
Yeah. So what he's arguing for is the removal of the supernatural when you are using it as an explanation for things.
Yeah.
But he has no issue with the supernatural when it comes to goodness, morality, a calling to live a better life, that there is a God, and what he wants from us is kind of holiness. And the Bible is a useful guide to holiness, as long as you don't get caught up in thinking that any of it might actually be true. That's his take. And so that's what he's doing. How did the book come to be written? Well, he wrote over about 30 years a series of articles where he built a case that said, here's another example of people taking doctrine and dogma too seriously and holding us back. Yeah. That's his big thing. You know, every time we take it too seriously, it's going to hold us back. The idea is to hold it loosely, take some sort of moral lesson from it, and then move on as soon as some new discovery is made. And eventually, a chap called Edward Newmans persuaded him that all of this work should be put into a book, which he did in 1896, so a couple of decades after Draper. But what it does is it forms a really effective pincer movement, because if you have a look at the two of them, then for the people watching this on video, the podcast guys are going to struggle, but for the people watching it on video, Draper's book is small, short, pithy, no footnotes, quite conversational, easy to dip in and out of. White's is like a kind of encyclopedia almost. It has 500 pages of footnotes in some of the versions, and so what you've got is the two of them backing each other up, telling very similar stories, and I think we'll get on to the stories they tell later on. Sure. But between them, they sort of took over. These were books that sold like hotcakes. Draper's, I think, was translated into about 25 different languages.
Insane,
we're talking more than 100 years ago. Everybody knew about these books, and it's actually fascinating to think that now nobody really knows who Draper and White were, and nobody really knows about their books, even though they were game changers for a couple of decades.
And even though the ideas that they presented, as you mentioned at the beginning, have permeated popular culture. Recently, I was trying to track down the origins of a particular silly idea, and I found it was Mark Twain, and I was reading Mark Twain's diaries, where he was talking about how he'd just been reading Draper and White and how impressed he was, and so really what's happened is that a lot of the popularization of these ideas has been done by non-historians and non-scientists, as is often the case. And this is something that I argue quite often. We rarely get taught this stuff. We just kind of absorb it. And so I often say to people, when were you taught that, the story of Galileo? And most people stop and scratch their head. And then I say, well, tell me the story of Galileo. And they tell me a story. It's usually wrong, usually wildly wrong. but we absorb this stuff. And I think another great example is the cartoon Family Guy. And there's an episode where Stewie and the dog Brian appear in what they appear in this other dimension in what looks like a futuristic world, and they think they're in the future, but then Stewie explains, no, this is the world where Christianity didn't hold back science, and so we're actually in the present, but we're in an alternative present where science wasn't suppressed. Now everyone gets the joke because they think that's true. Even those of us who know it's not true, you still get the joke.
Yeah, it's ironic that you mentioned the Family Guy, because one of the producers of the Family Guy, is the same producer of the new Cosmos series, the reboot of the Cosmos series. So you have that kind of mentality, that motivation for producing this kind of popular understanding of science by the same guy. Yeah. What is his name? Do you remember his name?
I'm trying to remember. It will come back to me in a moment.
You can edit it in later, Tim. Sound exactly like you've got it.
Yeah.
I'll put a footnote. Yeah, that's right. His name is Beep. But Carl Sagan is another repeat offender, and he was hugely influential on me as a young guy. He got me into a lot of science, which oddly enough led me into a lot of the history of science, and then I had to go and unlearn a whole lot of the history of science that Sagan had taught me in the original Cosmos. So the myth of Christians burning down the Great Library of Alexandria, which David referred to before, and which obviously I've spoken about many times. People don't know where they got that from, but they got it from Sagan, who in turn got it from Draper and White, who in turn kind of picked it up from the philosophers, people like Comte, you mentioned before, and Edward Gibbon, who's a beginning point for, he and Voltaire are a beginning point for a hell of a lot of these myths. Yeah. But recently I appeared on someone else's channel and was talking about this, and in the comments section afterwards, lots of people were getting very angry with me, which happens a lot. And they were insisting, well, there has been conflict between science and religion. What about creationism? There is conflict between science and religion. Science is based on reason and religion is based on belief. So there's a fundamental conflict. How do you respond to those kind of popular defenses of the concept of the conflict thesis?
Well, I think it is true that there is conflict now.
Yeah. To some extent, yeah.
I'll tell you a story. When I first went to university, so I'm in my early 20s, I went to the University Christian Union. So I am myself a Christian, which may mean that half of your listeners now turn off, Tim. But,
we do.
This is when everybody turns it off.
Yeah, we do allow Christians on this channel, so as long as you behave yourself, okay.
Yeah, okay, I'm trying. So I went to the University Christian Union, and of course, what happens is that you meet people from a whole bunch of different denominations. Whereas before, you've probably only been in one, and that's a bit of a shock to the system at first. And anyway, I thought, well, I better, I tried to be open-minded. I thought I better find out a bit more. So I went to a whole bunch of different churches during my time at university, just visiting, seeing different ideas. Well, I went to one church. It met in a barn. And there was someone playing the accordion. So to be honest, I probably should have walked out right at the start anyway. But it was kind of a bit bonkers, really. People jumping around, rolling on the floor, screaming, shouting, dancing. And then at one point, the leader said, if you want more of God, come to the front. The guy that was leading the service, right? And I thought, well, I think this is nuts. I do want more of God. So I went up to the front, and he said, I'm going to pray for you to get the gift of tongues. And he put his hand on me and he prayed, and then he pushed me. Now, not a lot happened because he was about 5'2". And I thought, I'm not buying this. And then he said, speak in tongues. And I couldn't, right? I couldn't speak in tongues. And then he said, it's not working. And I said, well,
Wow.
I know it's not working. but then he said, he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a student." And he said, "What do you study?" I said, "Well, I'm studying physics." And then he said, that'll be the problem. He said, "Your physics is getting in the way." Yeah, so this guy's theology was that physics got in the way of the ministry of the Holy Spirit to a Christian believer, right? Now that's someone within the church, and that's conflict.
Yeah.
So effectively what you're saying is, yes, there are conflicts, and there have been periods, there have been incidences of conflict throughout history. But I suppose we did kind of jump a fairly important part in the story, which is the fact that historians of science have rejected the conflict thesis and have done so for about 100 years.
Yeah.
And so maybe, James, why do historians of science not find the Draper White thesis convincing when it's so commonly accepted by popular in popular culture?
Yeah, Tim, it's really interesting because, again, Draper and White were not atheists. They were not trying to, again, they're not trying to somehow destroy Christianity or destroy religion. White looked to the religion of the future, kind of a more romantic understanding, religion of the heart. Draper looked to the religion of the past, kind of more rationalistic, natural, theological perspective of religion. But what happened by the end of the 19th century, and this is really interesting, we tell this narrative a little bit in our book, what happened at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, the ideas of Draper and White were appropriated by secularists, by free thinkers, by atheists, people who were more far removed than their own kind of religious upbringing. So, and perhaps one of the most important secularists to have kind of appropriated Draper and White historical narrative was this guy named Joseph McCabe. McCabe was a Roman Catholic monk who had abandoned his religious beliefs at the turn of the century, and he was an incredible writer. He wrote over 200 books on science, history, religion. He was an advocate of atheism. He forecast the doom of Christianity in the light of modern science. And interestingly enough, in 1927, he published a little blue book entitled The Conflict Between Science and Religion. I wonder where he got that title from. So McCabe essentially repeated the Draper-White narrative, but unlike Draper and White, he gleefully cheered on the decay of religion. And he wrote, interestingly enough, he wrote that historians of the 21st century would look back with amusement at the attempt of liberal Protestants trying to find some kind of reconciliation between science and religion. McCabe's perspective was that there's no reconciliation whatsoever. The most deadly foe, the most deadly opponent of scientific progress was Christianity, was religion. And he called those kind of progressive or modernist Christians living in the land of the bunk. So he was very critical at these attempts, Draper and White's own attempts to reconcile science and religion by downplaying theology, downplaying scripture. And I think from people like McCabe and others who kind of appropriated these narratives as an attack, not just on Roman Catholicism or conservative traditional Protestantism, they had appropriated this narrative and they used it across the board against all religion. And interestingly enough, the kind of the founding father of the discipline history of science, George Sarton, was also a fan. He was in a fan club of Andrew Dickson White, and he actually appealed to White at one point early in his career to help him find a job. So he knew White, he knew his book, he used his book in his classroom, but George Sarton himself was an atheist, and he believed that religion would ultimately disappear. So it's kind of a story of unintended consequences. These guys wanted to use their narratives to sort of purify and help religion, but then others came and picked it up and started using it everything without contextualizing those narratives whatsoever. So
sure, but these days, my understanding is that if you asked a historian of science, I think you earlier mentioned Ronald Numbers, and people like the late David Lindbergh, they reject the conflict thesis, and Lindbergh, in particular, was to his dying day was sort of fighting battle against the popular conception of it. But the general conception these days is, and I think Peter Harrison has summed this up quite nicely, it's complicated. So yes, there have been periods of conflict. There have been incidences of conflict, but there have also been periods and incidences where religion has inspired and generated scientific idea. And that's something that my fellow atheists of the non-theistic, anti-theistic persuasion dislike intensely. The idea that religion could be in any way a positive force on the development of science, despite the fact that Newton, Kepler, various others said as much. I mean, they made it absolutely clear that their science was driven by their religious convictions. I'm in the middle of writing an article about Galileo, and it's inspired by a fellow who calls himself the Cosmic Skeptic. I don't know if you've come across him, but he's a 23-year-old Oxford graduate and has all the great confidence of a 23-year-old Oxford graduate. And he did a video called the Trial of Galileo, What Really Happened. And you won't be too surprised to hear that he doesn't get it right at all. It's proving to be quite a long, complicated article because I'm trying to explain exactly what he gets wrong, and the answer is a lot. Yeah. But the interesting thing is that these guys always reject the idea that anyone can be inspired by religion. And he O'Connor started off by saying, well, of course Galileo was a Christian. He couldn't be anything else because otherwise he'd be tortured and burned at the stake. If you actually read Galileo's writings, he wasn't very devout. Well, he was Italian after all. He had children out of wedlock and so on. He was a man of appetites, but he was clearly a Christian believer. And in fact, the whole letter to the Grand Duchess Christina is a very sophisticated and actually very good piece of theology. He's clearly trying to reconcile what he believes, which is the Copernican model, with his Christian faith. So I think it's interesting. I'm sure you'd agree that my fellow atheists of the anti-theistic. I'm trying to avoid the phrase "new atheist." It's becoming a bit hackneyed, but those guys are clinging to a 19th century idea that modern historians of science, whether they're Christians or not, have rejected completely. It's kind of paradoxical that these people who say we should pay attention to expert and we should not pay attention to stuff out of mere tradition and convenience, doing exactly that on this particular point. Quite remarkable.
I think one of the things I guess the question you really want to dig into, Tim, is why won't this idea go away? Like, if we're now at the point where for about 50 years the consensus in the academic world is that the conflict thesis is wrong, how long is it going to take for that to be considered to be true in the popular sphere, right? In the public sphere, and what is it about it that won't go away?
I think I've got some thoughts on that, and because I've been trying to answer that question. I mean, a couple of years ago, a collection of essays called "The Warfare Between Science and Religion" came out, edited by Ronald Numbers and Ronald A. Binsley, and the subtitle of that is "The Idea That Wouldn't Die." Yeah. And it's a great collection. It's pretty dense stuff. It's very much for the academic. But one of the things that struck me afterwards is I was trying to think, why is it that people, when I point out the problems with the thesis, the people just they don't want to believe me. They try to find a way in which the Galileo affair is purely science versus religion, and not the politics that was the actual problem, and they really struggle really, really hard to maintain the myth. I think that this idea that religion has been holding us back, and that the secular nation state is the cure for religion is actually very, very deep in. It's a mythology that's very, very deep in our culture, because our culture is very much one of the modern secular nation state. Now, I'm saying that as someone who thinks the modern secular nation state is a pretty good thing, right? I really like the idea of separation of church and state. I really like the idea of secular education. I like the idea of democracy and so on. But it doesn't mean that the foundations of that thing that I like are all necessarily completely true. And I think this is one of the reasons why we are actually founded on that philosophical tradition that said everything was chaotic and religious before we came along, and we are good and right. Sam Harris really encapsulates this, and he's writing a book where in his early chapters he's condemning torture by the Inquisition because that's evil, and then in the later chapters he's recommending torture of potential Muslim terrorists because that's okay. Why? Well, because it's evil when religion does it, but when the secular nation state does it, that's good because we are the good people, which is what every religious fanatic out there the whole of history has always said to justify torture, including the Inquisition. So the ironies here are profound. But one of the things that really strikes me about it is that these guys, the new atheists, I'll call them that, they don't even argue for this conflict thesis. They just assume it.
Mm.
Right? Have you found that? I mean, Jerry Coyne does a bit of an attempt at apologia.
No, Tim, I really appreciate that and what you're saying here. You know, it's really complicated. I mean, you have to define what do you mean by secular, right? You have authors like Tara Burton. Tara Burton, she published a book called Strange Rights a couple of years ago, where she looked at the notion of secular and looked at kind of the rise of the nuns in the 21st century, the N-O-N-E-S, nuns, not the Catholic kind. But anyway, she's talking about the rise of the nuns, the people who believe in some kind of meaning, some kind of wider meaning to human life, but they reject institutional religion. So her understanding of secular is drawn from sociologists of religion, that secular does not necessarily mean anti-religious, but more like how actually White understands religion as non-sectarian. You know, people have this religion, whether it's kind of family or sporting events or what have you, something that gives them some kind of wider meaning in life. They still have this religion. They kind of pick and choose various parts to it, but that's the nuns. They are the religiously unaffiliated. So when we're talking about secular, I think we need to kind of carefully define how we understand it. And again, maybe David has a different perspective on this than I do, but as a kind of historian of theology as well, I look at people like Galileo and Kepler and Copernicus. Yeah, they were very religious men. Isaac Newton, very religious men, but their religion was very different from Orthodox Christianity, right? I mean, one of the reasons why Galileo got in such heat and such trouble is that he was proposing a new way to understand Scripture. He was proposing a new way to interpret Scripture at a time right after the Protestant Reformation, where the church was kind of holding tightly to how one should interpret the Scriptures, and the Protestants were interpreting Scripture in their own way. And to some extent, Roman Catholics were right in saying that this would lead to chaos, because it indeed led to chaos. There was so much religious warfare and bloodshed that came after the Protestant Reformation. We have some thinkers like the English deists who said, okay, enough of this bloodshed. Let's find these kind of common notions of what is natural religion. Well, everybody has some kind of understanding of religion, but let's get rid of all this dogma and all this theology and all this scriptures inspiration type of thing, and then we'd find peace in the land. We would make peace with each other. That didn't happen, right? But this was the attempt, because again, what you're having here is this really complicated mixture of people who are still very much religious, but in a different sense. They're redefining religion. And I would argue today that's still happening. When people talk about there's a conflict between these abstract notions of religion and science, what they're really arguing, there's a contention between different religious beliefs, whether it's kind of an atheological perspective or a more traditional theological perspective. It's still in play. What Draper and White were arguing, that there was contention between different religious groups, it's still happening today, even though people would call themselves atheists and one person would call themselves Christian. This theology is still playing a factor.
Sure. David, what are your thoughts on why it is still such a pervasive idea?
Yeah, I think there are two big things going on. One is it's been argued by a lot of people that the way that a human being thinks is that at their very, very base level, their foundation is their worldview. And then once they've got their worldview, what they then do is they build on that with different ways that they think about particular topics. But there's a chap called N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, who's a famous theologian and historian. And he says, no, there's a level below worldview, which is really interesting. And I've come to agree with him. And he says the level below your worldview will actually sit on something. And what it will sit on is a story. He says, like, the fundamental unit of belief for a person is story. That's what we're most strongly drawn to. And if you look at the most influential teachers, the most influential game changers in all of history, they're all storytellers, all of them. In one way or another, they tell stories. So I think the number one reason why the conflict thesis won't go away is that it's a really simple and really powerful story. Yeah. It has a good guy, science, reason. It has a bad guy, church, religion, right?
Yeah.
And then it has key characters like Galileo or Bruno or the Greeks or the Romans, or the dirty Middle Ages. So it has these characters, and it's just such an easy story to understand. And so I think that's why it sticks around. And then what you do, if N.T. Wright is correct, which I think he is, what you do is that story doesn't sit up here on top of your worldview. It sinks down underneath. It becomes God versus science becomes a story, which then other things sit on, right? So when you suddenly hear, oh, look, there's a bunch of people in America that won't get the vaccine, what you do is you sit it on top of the, oh, that's God versus science.
Right. Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? And so I think that's what happens. And then I think the second reason for it, a secondary reason, is that it's a very convenient story for a lot of people to believe, right? Because the great challenge, in particular in Christianity, but the great challenge in religion is that, and I'll speak for Christianity, it puts some kind of moral demand onto your life, right? It says something along the lines of, there is a right way to live. And if you don't live that way, then in some sense you're guilty, right? And people who want to be free of that, who want to say, well, I don't want that moral call on my life from that religion, this gives an out. I had a situation where a couple of years ago I was leading like a little kind of Bible study group, and someone had invited a friend along. And afterwards I was chatting to this guy, and it turned out he wasn't a believer. He just had come along by invitation. And I said to him, do you believe in God? And he said, no, I believe in science, right? That was his answer. But the thing is, he wasn't a scientist. When I sort of asked him a little bit about it, it was clear he didn't really know any science. And he certainly couldn't give any actual scientific reason for why he didn't believe in God.
Yeah.
But his answer was a convenient answer for him to give. And it was one that he clearly expected somebody to say, oh, right, yeah, okay. Because science provides you with solid ground, doesn't it? It's rational, it's reasonable. Everybody knows science works because they can stream Netflix. I think that's the second reason, that for a lot of people, and particularly the people you're talking about, Tim, who are anti-theistic popularizers, this is really convenient, and it's a really powerful storyline for them to hold on to. For them to let go of it would be, it would sort of be cataclysmic to the way that they think about the world a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And whatever camp you're in, that's a difficult thing to do.
it would be. It's pretty rare for me to agree with NT Wright, who I disagree with on many things, but I actually agree with him on that. I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because yeah, you're right. I come across these people all the time, and they probably irritate me as much as they irritate you, because what they're effectively doing is they're using science. They're not talking about science. They're talking about this kind of thing, which is they've used as a substitute for what they had previously believed, or what they might have been brought up to believe, or what they've kind of been fed culturally. And it's a sort of a substitute. I don't, he said it then, I don't believe in God, I believe in science, which means that quite often they have this very simplistic view of science.
Mm-hmm.
And what you end up with is science as this dogmatic, it's kind of a scientism. Everything can be explained by science. And whenever I come across someone saying everything can be explained by science, I always say, okay, prove that scientifically.
Yeah.
And then watch them squirm, because you can't. And this is often in the context of people who say that philosophy is pointless, and philosophy is just idiots who don't really understand science, foodling around, chasing their tails. And I go, okay, fine, prove that scientifically. And they immediately launch into a bad philosophical argument. I'm like, okay, you're now doing philosophy, you're not doing science.
Yeah, that's right.
And they get very, very confused. The same thing happens when I'm talking to many people who are believers in one of my other bugbears, which is the Jesus myth idea, the idea that there was no historical Jesus.
Yeah.
Effectively, what they've done is they've gone from a fundamentalist belief in Christianity to a fundamentalist belief in a new dogma, which is the idea that there was no historical Jesus. And they act exactly like evangelical fundamentalist Christians, right down to citing holy books and holding up prophets, and and the anger that they get if you defy them, if you're particularly a heretic like me, because I'm an atheist, but I'm not a physicist. I confuse them greatly. I also confuse them greatly when I come along and debunk their simplistic stories, and when I tell them that no, actually the Galileo story isn't what you think. The church had the science of the day firmly on its side, and referred to it in their judgment. They said this is absurd in philosophy. That means this is scientifically wrong. Yeah. They get very confused because it doesn't fit the simple story. I'm complicating things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but again, this confidence that we have in science, again, it stems from certain religious thinkers, certain theologians in the 17th and 18th century who looked towards natural philosophy as a way to kind of bring peace to their society. And again, you have Roman Catholics that use this kind of polemic against other religious traditions to show them that these pagan religious traditions are irrational, or they believe in all this superstitious stuff. And then when the Protestant Reformation came along, the Protestant reformers started using the same polemic against Roman Catholics. They used a polemic of history, they used a polemic of rationalism, they used a polemic of natural philosophy, science against Roman Catholics. And then what happens after that, you see Protestants started using that same polemic against each other. You have the more liberal Protestants using it against the Puritans. You have the Puritans using it against the more liberal Protestants. So it's just this fascinating, really complex, really rich, really hard to wrap your mind around this kind of history. And I think this is why most people like the simplistic narrative of science and religion, because those are black and white. Those are very simple to understand. But the historical reality, it's really, really messy.
Always more complicated. And this is why I begin many of my videos with a little fairy tale once upon a time and little fairy tale music in the background, because what I'm doing is, in my silly way, mocking the simplicity of these stories. I'm also interested, and we've already touched on this, but I'm interested in how often these new atheist arguments are effectively just a rebadged Catholic or usually rebadged Protestant argument. And someone once facetiously described Dawkins as basically a Protestant polemicist, which made him very angry. But this is because a hell of a lot of his stuff is just anti-Catholic, stuff being regurgitated.
Yeah.
Every Christmas I have to wearily fight and Easter and Halloween the tide of what is effectively a Puritan story about how those festivals are pagan and were imposed on Christianity by the Catholic Church. Now, this story is now being used by new atheists every year. Ha ha ha, silly Christians, they're celebrating Christmas. Christmas is really pagan. It's not true. But what's even more ironic is that they're basically just recycling a Puritan myth that was then spread by evangelical Protestants.
Yeah.
And yet, of course, they're very rational and they check their facts. Guys, we have been talking for over an hour, so look, I do really appreciate your time. Some great stuff there. I would highly recommend your book. Sometimes the books I recommend are quite dense and academic and so on. This one is every bit as good as anything else I've recommended on this channel, but it's greatly entertaining. I think David, the high school teacher, has done a fantastic job of keeping us entertained, and James, really, again, I thank you for writing a book that taught me stuff. That's always a good thing to have, and a great accolade, I think, for both of you. And I look forward to what you guys are going to do next. So, on behalf of History for Atheists, thank you very much for coming on the show, and all the best.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Tim. Will you permit me a final comment?
Oh, of course, please. Yeah.
If the issue is that there's a story sitting at the bottom, you're never going to remove that story by bringing in complexity, right? Complexity doesn't have the power to remove a story. What you have to do is the only thing that can uproot a story is another story, right? And it needs to be simple and it needs to be powerful. And so that is why I wanted to write about Draper and White, because what can the tagline be here? You can say, did you know that 150 years ago, two guys you've never heard of fooled the entire Western world, including the experts, and they're still fooling them now? Yeah. That's a great story, isn't it? And so, that's what I think, hopefully that's why people will pick up the book. Hang on a second, you're telling me I've been fooled, and everybody else has been fooled too, by two people I've never heard of. That's fascinating. So that's the hope that story can uproot the other story.
I'm very much guilty of trying to uproot stories by introducing complexity. So I'm going to take that lesson, David, and I think that's a great note on which we can end this conversation. So thank you very much to you both. Have a good day.
Thanks, Tim.
Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with James and David, and I highly recommend their excellent book. And no, not just because it says nice things about me. For detailed articles on some of the myths that are used to sustain the conflict thesis idea, check out the Great Myths series on the History for Atheists website. For a detailed debunking of the myths around Galileo, I also recommend my 3-part conversation with Tony Christie on my video channel and podcast. And for further interesting conversations and debunking of historical myths, see you again here soon.